The October wind carried a bitter edge through the streets of Mayfair, rattling the windows of the grand townhouses and sending dead leaves skittering across the cobblestones like whispered secrets too fragile to take root. Inside the opulent ballroom of Lord and Lady Pembridge, crystal chandeliers cast their warm glow upon the assembled company, illuminating silks and jewels and the carefully arranged faces of London's finest. Yet there existed pockets of shadow, even in such brilliance, and it was toward these darker margins that Lady Evelyn Ashworth had learned to gravitate. She stood near a pillar adorned with autumn flowers, chrysanthemums, the color of rust and gold, their heavy heads nodding as if in commiseration, and observed the swirling dancers with the practiced expression of polite interest that had become her armor against the world's scrutiny. At 40 years of age, she had long since ceased to be a subject of romantic speculation. She had instead become something far worse in society's estimation, an object of pity. She could feel it in the sidelong glances of the matrons, in the overly solicitous inquiries about her health, in the way conversations seemed to pause and redirect themselves when she approached, as though her unmarried state were a contagion that might spread through mere proximity. "Poor Lady Evelyn," they murmured behind fans painted with pastoral scenes that mocked the barrenness of her situation. 40 and unwed, what a tragedy. Such a handsome woman she was in her youth, and with reasonable fortune besides. One wonders what went wrong. She had wondered that herself, in the early years, but time had a way of filing down the sharp edges of regret until they became smooth and manageable, something one could carry in one's pocket without drawing blood. She had made her choices, or rather, choices had been made for her by duty and circumstance, and the inexorable expectations of family, and she had learned to inhabit the life those choices had constructed with as much grace as she could muster. The ballroom felt close despite its vastness, the air thick with perfume and perspiration, and the cloying sweetness of hothouse flowers forced to bloom out of season. Evelyn lifted her gloved hand to adjust the modest pearls at her throat, her mother's pearls, passed down not with joy but with a sigh of resignation that they would adorn no bride, and felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came from breathing air that seemed to belong to everyone but herself. Outside, she knew, the autumn chill was deepening toward winter, the season of death and dormancy, and she felt a kinship with those stripped trees in the squares, standing dignified in their bareness, no longer pretending to be anything other than what they were. "She never married, you know," a voice drifted from behind a nearby arrangement of ferns, loud enough to be overheard, soft enough to claim accident. One must assume there was some deficiency, some failing that prevented any gentleman from offering. Evelyn's fingers tightened imperceptibly on her fan, but her expression remained serene, as still as a portrait. Asterisk, let them wonder, asterisk, she thought, with the weary resignation of one who has ceased to fight battles that cannot be won. Asterisk, let them invent their stories. The truth would mean nothing to them anyway. Asterisk, but before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. If Lady Evelyn Ashworth had become an object of pity in the drawing rooms of London, then His Grace the Duke of Blackthorn, Marcus Rothwell, had become something altogether different, a mystery, an enigma, a subject of endless speculation that had occupied the gossips of the Tun for 15 years without resolution. He stood now near the terrace doors of the Pembridge ballroom, a figure carved from granite and shadow, his posture so perfectly controlled that he might have been a statue commissioned to represent aristocratic disdain. At 38, he possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that intimidated rather than invited, dark hair silvering slightly at the temples, eyes the color of winter steel, a mouth that seemed to have forgotten the shape of genuine warmth. Ice-cold Blackthorn, they called him, though never to his face, for despite his frigid demeanor he commanded a respect born of ancient title, considerable wealth, and the unsettling impression that he could see through social pretense to the calculating hearts beneath. For 15 years, since assuming his title at 23 upon his father's unexpected death, he had refused every matrimonial overture with a consistency that had progressed from surprising to scandalous to simply expected. The ambitious mammas had long since ceased thrusting their daughters into his path. The matchmaking hostesses no longer seated eligible young ladies beside him at dinner. Even the most determined fortune hunters had accepted that the Duke of Blackthorn was simply not to be caught. Society had invented countless theories to explain his obdurate bachelorhood, that he harbored unnatural preferences, that he had taken a secret vow, that he was incapable of human feeling, that his heart had been damaged by some unnamed tragedy in his youth, that he considered himself too superior for any woman in England. The truth, which no one suspected because it was both too simple and too extraordinary, was that his heart had been given completely and irrevocably in a single summer afternoon 15 years ago, and he had never sought to reclaim it. He attended society functions with the regularity expected of his position, but without any appearance of pleasure, moving through ballrooms like a spectre, dancing when duty demanded it, conversing with impeccable politeness that nevertheless conveyed absolute disinterest in deepening any acquaintance. Hostesses invited him because his presence lent consequence to their gatherings, but no one expected him to enjoy himself, and he never disappointed those low expectations. Tonight, however, something had shifted in his carefully maintained composure, though the change was so subtle that even the most acute observers failed to notice it. His attention, which typically drifted over the assembled company with democratic indifference, had fixed itself upon a particular point in the ballroom, a woman in dove-grey silk, standing beside a pillar of chrysanthemums, her posture conveying a dignity that society mistook for resignation. Marcus's hand tightened imperceptibly on the glass of wine he held, and something flickered in those winter eyes, something that might have been recognition or longing, or the kind of pain that has been carried so long it has become indistinguishable from identity itself. He watched as Lady Evelyn Ashworth adjusted the pearls at her throat, watched as she maintained her composure in the face of whispers she undoubtedly heard, watched with the focused intensity of a man who had been watching from various distances and vantage points. For 15 years, no one noticed his attention because no one expected the Duke of Blackthorn to notice anything, least of all a woman whom society had deemed past consideration. But in that moment, his entire being was oriented toward her, like a compass toward true north, and had been, through all the long seasons of waiting, since the day he had lost her. 15 years slipped away like silk through fingers, and Marcus found himself standing once again in memory at the Haverford summer garden party of 1810, when the world had still been painted in colours bright enough to hurt the eyes, and hope had not yet learned to disguise itself as resignation. He had been 23, newly elevated to his title after his father's sudden passing, still raw with grief and the overwhelming responsibilities of a dukedom he had not expected to inherit for decades, and he had sought refuge from the pressing condolences and opportunistic introductions in the far reaches of the garden, where roses climbed ancient stone walls, and the sound of music and laughter faded to a pleasant murmur beneath the drone of bees. It was there, in that sun-drenched sanctuary, that he had encountered her, Lady Evelyn Ashworth, at 25, not a debutante but not yet resigned to spinsterhood, standing alone among the roses, with a book of poetry in her hands and an expression of such peaceful solitude that he had hesitated to intrude upon it. But she had looked up at his approach, and instead of the calculating assessment he had already learned to expect from every unmarried woman in his vicinity, her eyes had held only gentle curiosity and something that might have been understanding, as though she recognized in him a fellow seeker of quiet spaces. They had spoken for perhaps an hour, though time had seemed to operate differently in that garden, stretching and compressing in ways that defied the steady progression of the sun across the sky. They had discussed poetry at first. She had been reading Wordsworth, and he had confessed a preference for the earlier metaphysical poets, but the conversation had deepened with remarkable swiftness, moving past the superficial pleasantries that typically bounded social exchange into territory that felt dangerously genuine. She had spoken of the burden of expectations, of the narrowness of the paths deemed acceptable for a woman of quality, of the hunger for purpose beyond ornamental existence, and he had found himself responding with an honesty he had never before risked, speaking of his father's death, of the loneliness of elevated position, of the way grief and duty could become indistinguishable from one another. She had not offered empty platitudes or attempted to redirect the conversation toward lighter matters. Instead, she had listened with her entire being, her grey eyes holding his with a directness that should have been improper, but felt instead like recognition, as though some essential part of himself that he had thought invisible was being seen and acknowledged for the first time. He had been reaching for her hand. He could still remember the exact angle of afternoon light that gilded her skin, the way a strand of dark hair had escaped her careful arrangement to curl against her neck, the precise moment when he had understood with absolute certainty that he had found the woman he would love for the entirety of his existence, when they had been interrupted by her mother's sharp voice, calling her back to the house, and she had startled like someone waking from a dream, offered him an apologetic smile that carried something of regret, and hurried away through the rose arbor. The next morning, the announcement had appeared in the papers. Lady Evelyn Ashworth was engaged to Lord Edmund Thornbury, the wedding to take place within 3 months. Marcus had read those words in his study as rain began to fall against the windows, and something inside him had simply stopped, calcified, turned to stone, and he had understood in that moment that his heart would remain forever in that sun-filled garden, offered and refused, and that every refusal he issued from that day forward would be in service to that first, unspoken devotion. The morning after the Pembridge ball, Evelyn returned to Ashworth House not in Mayfair but in the quieter precincts of Bloomsbury, to the elegant but modest townhouse that had belonged to her late brother Thomas and now served as home to his orphaned children, and the woman society Pitied, but who had, in the 5 years since Thomas's death, discovered a purpose that transcended the narrow definitions of feminine success that the Ton employed in its relentless categorizations. She had been 35 when Thomas and his wife had perished in a carriage accident, leaving behind 7-year-old Charlotte and 5-year-old James, and she had assumed their guardianship without hesitation, moving from her own smaller residence into this house still haunted by grief, transforming herself from spinster aunt into something approximating mother, though she never claimed that title, feeling it belonged eternally to her lost sister-in-law. The children were 12 and 10 now, poised on the edge of that transformation from childhood to whatever came next, and they had given her what society's pity could never touch: a reason to wake each morning with purpose, a love that asked nothing of her but presence and patience, a family constructed not from matrimonial success, but from loyalty and necessity, and the kind of devotion that deepens in the crucible of shared sorrow. She managed the estate with a competence that would have surprised those who thought her merely decorative, had learned the intricacies of investment and property management, corresponded with Thomas's man of business with an authority that initially surprised him and eventually earned his respect, ensured that her niece and nephew would inherit a legacy not diminished by her stewardship but enhanced by it. Charlotte was showing remarkable aptitude for languages and music, and Evelyn had secured the finest tutors, determined that her niece would have choices she herself had been denied. James was gentler, more bookish, with Thomas's thoughtful temperament, and she protected his sensitivity in a world that would too soon demand he perform a masculinity foreign to his nature. In the afternoons, when lessons were complete and before dinner preparations began, Evelyn often retreated to the small walled garden behind the house, a space she had cultivated over the years into something approximating beauty despite the London soot and limited sun, and it was there, among the roses she tended with her own gloved hands and the herbs that grew in careful rows, that she allowed herself to feel the weight of what society named failure and what she understood, in her most honest moments, to be a life both smaller and richer than she had once imagined. She thought sometimes of that summer garden 15 years ago, of the conversation that had felt like a door opening onto possibilities she had not known existed, of the young Duke with grief in his eyes and intelligence in his conversation, and she wondered, as she had wondered countless times across the years, what might have happened if her mother had not called her away, if duty and family pressure had not already determined her path, if she had possessed the courage to reach back when he had reached forward. But such thoughts were indulgent, belonged to a younger woman who still believed in the rearrangement of fate. And Evelyn had learned to find contentment, if not joy, in the life she had been given, and to measure her worth not by society's cold calculations, but by the love in Charlotte's eyes when she mastered a difficult passage of music, by James's trust when he brought her his fears and questions, by the garden that bloomed despite unfavorable conditions, by the quiet dignity of a life lived in service to something larger than her own disappointed hopes. The Dowager Duchess of Blackthorn, Lady Henrietta Rothwell, was a woman of considerable perception and even greater determination. qualities that had served her well through 6 decades of navigating society's treacherous waters, and which she now employed in what she privately considered her final great project, the salvation of her nephew from a loneliness that had calcified around him like armor these 15 years past. She was one of perhaps 3 people in England who knew the truth of Marcus's perpetual refusals, having extracted the confession from him one winter evening, 7 years prior, when grief and solitude had temporarily weakened his formidable defenses, and she had watched with mingled admiration and frustration as he maintained his vigil for a woman he believed forever, beyond his reach, married to another, lost to him as completely as if she had died. But Henrietta possessed an intelligence network that would have impressed the Foreign Office, comprised of ladies' maids and footmen and distant cousins positioned throughout London's great houses, and she had learned within days of Lord Edmund Thornbury's death 5 years ago that the marriage had been unhappy, that Evelyn had been released from that prison, if not into happiness, then at least into the quieter sorrows of widowhood and purpose, and she had been waiting ever since for the proper moment to intervene in what she considered a tragedy of mutual longing and misapprehension. The Michaelmas house party had been her weapon of choice, traditional enough to raise no suspicions, yet intimate enough to force proximity, and she had composed her invitation to Lady Evelyn Ashworth with the care of a general planning, a decisive campaign, emphasizing the informal nature of the gathering, the presence of several blue-stocking ladies who shared Evelyn's intellectual inclinations, the opportunity for Charlotte to meet young people of quality in a less pressured environment than a London season would provide. The invitation had arrived at Ashworth House on a grey October morning when the first frost had silvered the garden, and Evelyn's initial impulse had been to decline with polite regret, for she knew the Dowager Duchess only slightly, and could not imagine why such an elevated personage would think to include a woman of her modest social position. But Charlotte had discovered the invitation before Evelyn could compose her refusal, and had responded with such uncharacteristic enthusiasm. "Oh, Aunt Evelyn, please say we might go. I have heard Blackthorn Manor has the most magnificent library, and the Duchess is said to be so kind, and it would be such an adventure," that Evelyn had found her resistance crumbling beneath her niece's bright hope. She had not wanted to disappoint the girl who had already endured so much loss, who deserved what small pleasures could be provided, and so despite the unease that whispered warnings she could not quite articulate, despite the memory of grey eyes in a summer garden that surfaced unbidden whenever she heard the name Blackthorn, despite the certainty that she would be out of place among guests whose consequence far exceeded her own, Evelyn had written her acceptance in careful script, sealed it with wax that seemed to harden with the weight of premonition, and dispatched it before wisdom could reassert itself, and remind her that women of 40 had no business accepting invitations that made their hearts beat faster for reasons they refused to examine too closely. Blackthorn Manor rose from the Derbyshire landscape like something conjured from darker imaginings, all grey stone and imposing architecture, its towers reaching towards skies that seemed perpetually overcast in this northern country. And as the carriage bearing Evelyn and Charlotte wound up the long drive lined with ancient oaks whose bare branches clawed at the October air, Evelyn felt her breath catch with something between apprehension and a recognition she could not name, as though the house itself were a physical manifestation of the man who inhabited it, formidable, solitary, built to withstand sieges, both literal and metaphorical. Charlotte pressed her face to the carriage window with undisguised excitement, but Evelyn found her hands twisting in her lap, smoothing the fabric of her travelling dress with nervous repetition, telling herself that her unease was merely the natural discomfort of a woman unaccustomed to such grand company, that the acceleration of her pulse had nothing to do with memories of a summer garden or the dangerous hope that had taken root despite her best efforts to deny it nourishment. The Dowager Duchess received them in the great entrance hall with genuine warmth that did much to ease Evelyn's initial intimidation, but it was the figure standing slightly behind his aunt, tall and still as carved marble, that drew Evelyn's gaze with magnetic inevitability. And for a moment that stretched between seconds, Marcus Rothwell's grey eyes met hers with an impact that felt almost physical, and she saw in their depths such naked recognition, such undisguised emotion, quickly shuttered behind the practiced courtesy of 15 years' concealment, that her carefully maintained composure nearly shattered. "Lady Ashworth," he said, and his voice was exactly as she remembered it, deep and measured, though she heard beneath its formality a tremor that perhaps only she could detect. "Welcome to Blackthorn Manor." She managed her curtsy, managed some appropriate words of gratitude that her voice delivered without consulting her reeling thoughts, and when he took her hand for the briefest moment required by propriety, she felt the warmth of his touch through her glove, like a brand that marked her as fundamentally altered from the woman who had arrived moments before. The other guests, already assembled in the drawing-room for tea, observed this greeting with the sharp attention society trained upon any interaction involving the famously reclusive Duke and Lady Pemberton, whose talent for observation exceeded her discretion, would later remark to her particular friend that she had never seen Blackthorn look at anyone the way he had looked at that Ashworth woman, as though she were some precious thing he had thought lost forever and could not quite believe restored to him, while Lord Hastings noted, with the confusion of a man who had watched Marcus refuse a dozen beautiful heiresses, that the Duke himself carried Lady Ashworth's travelling case up to her rooms, a task properly belonging to servants, and then spent the entire tea service positioned where he might observe her without obviousness, his legendary ice touched by something that looked remarkably like the thaw of long-frozen hope, finally permitted to surface. The first days of the house party unfolded with a rhythm of formal activities and structured entertainments, yet beneath the surface propriety, Evelyn became aware of accumulations so subtle she might have dismissed them as coincidence, had they not gathered with such persistent weight, small gestures that whispered of attention far beyond mere hospitality. She discovered that her rooms were not merely adequate, but the finest guest chambers in the East Wing, a position to catch the morning light she had once mentioned, preferring in a conversation 15 years distant that she herself had half forgotten. The windows overlooking gardens designed in the Italian style, with stone paths winding between boxwood hedges that held their green even in October's decline. At breakfast the first morning, she found without requesting it a pot of the specific Chinese tea she favoured, a blend not commonly served, and which she had mentioned in passing only once in Marcus's hearing that long-ago summer, and when she glanced up in surprise, she caught his gaze upon her with an expression that vanished so quickly behind studied neutrality. She wondered if she had imagined the hope that had flickered there like candlelight behind glass. He remembered. Some part of her whispered with dangerous insistence, "He has remembered details you thought lost to time," and the realization sent confusion cascading through her carefully maintained equilibrium, because she could not fathom why a duke of his consequence would retain such minutiae about a woman he had met so briefly, but she could not complete that thought, could not permit herself to imagine what such attention might signify, for surely she misread mere courtesy as something more substantial, surely her own long-buried feelings were painting significance onto gestures that meant nothing beyond proper hospitality. Yet, the moments continued to accumulate like snow that seems inconsequential until suddenly the world is transformed. Marcus somehow always present when she entered a room, his positioning such that he might observe her without obviousness, the way his attention tracked her movements even while appearing engaged in conversation with others, how he steered discussions toward topics. She had expertise in literature and estate management and the philosophy of education, creating space for her voice to be heard among guests who might otherwise have dismissed her as merely the poor relation. On the third afternoon, when the other guests elected to ride out to view the famous Blackthorn waterfalls, Marcus quietly suggested that she might prefer a walk through the estate gardens and that the paths were gentle and the autumn colours particularly fine from the southern terrace, and something in his tone made it clear this was invitation rather than mere suggestion, that he wished for her company specifically, and though every instinct of self-preservation warned her against such private contact, though she knew the other guests would note their absence and draw conclusions that might damage her already precarious social standing, Evelyn found herself accepting, drawn by a pull she had felt only once before in her life, in another garden, in another season, when she had been young enough to believe in possibilities. They walked in silence initially, a silence that felt less awkward than weighted with things unspoken, the October air crisp with the scent of dying leaves and earth preparing for winter's sleep, and Evelyn was acutely conscious of his presence beside her, the careful distance he maintained, as though afraid that proximity might shatter some fragile understanding. He spoke first of inconsequential matters, the history of the gardens, the challenge of maintaining such grounds, the various plantings his mother had introduced decades past. But beneath the surface banality, Evelyn sensed deeper currents, the way his voice softened when he mentioned his mother's love of roses, the wistfulness that colored his description of the garden's design, meant to provide year-round interest, as though he were speaking not of horticulture, but of constancy, of beauty that persisted through seasons of barrenness. She responded in kind, describing her own modest gardens at Ashworth House, the pleasure she found in nurturing growth, the satisfaction of patient cultivation, and she felt him listening with an intensity that made her suddenly self-conscious, made her stumble over words that normally came easily, because his attention felt like sunlight after years of shadow, and she did not know what to do with such focused regard. They paused beside a stone fountain where water still played despite the advancing cold, and Marcus turned to face her with an expression that held such barely restrained emotion that her breath caught, and for a moment she thought he would speak something of consequence, would give voice to the questions that hummed between them, like the fountain's music. But then footsteps sounded on the gravel path and other guests appeared, and whatever he had been about to say was lost, shuttered behind the courteous mask he wore for the world, leaving Evelyn with the aching certainty that she had been on the cusp of understanding something that might alter everything, and with the confused recognition that her heart, which she had believed safely dormant, and had somehow awakened without her permission, and now beat with rhythms she had thought forever, beyond her capacity to feel. The evening gathering assembled in the grand drawing-room, where candlelight flickered against damask walls and cast shadows that softened the formal severity of ancestral portraits. The guests arranged in clusters of conversation that held the peculiar quality of performance that characterized society interactions, each person aware of being observed even as they observed others, and it was Lord Pemberton who introduced the topic that would unsettle the careful equilibrium Marcus had maintained throughout the house party, saying with the thoughtless jocularity of a man well pleased with wine and his own wit, "Blackthorn, we were discussing your legendary refusals, 15 years of them, is it not? Lady Pemberton insists you must have impossible standards, that no woman born could meet your requirements for perfection." The comment drew laughter from several quarters, the easy amusement of those who did not perceive the cruelty embedded in such observation, and Evelyn, positioned near the pianoforte where Charlotte had been playing earlier, felt her attention sharpen on Marcus with sudden protective instinct, saw the almost imperceptible tension that entered his shoulders, the way his hand tightened fractionally on the brandy glass he held, the careful neutrality that descended over features she was learning to read for their subtle variations. "Perhaps," Lady Pemberton added with the archness she mistook for charm, "the Duke awaits some mythical creature of perfection who exists only in imagination, a lady of impossible beauty and accomplishment who will never materialize, leaving our dear Blackthorn eternally disappointed by we mere mortals." Marcus's response came with measured civility that concealed whatever he truly felt. "Perhaps I simply value constancy over novelty, Lady Pemberton, and prefer to wait for what matters rather than settle for what merely suffices." And though his tone remained courteous, Evelyn caught the edge beneath the words, the suggestion of depths these guests could not perceive, and she found herself wondering what constancy he spoke of, what it was he waited for with such patience that society interpreted as cold rejection. The conversation moved onward, as conversations do, turning to other gossip and observations, but Evelyn remained disturbed by what she had witnessed, by the discomfort Marcus had tried to hide, by the sudden conviction that his 15 years of refusals carried significance these people could not fathom, that behind his legendary coldness lay something far more complex than mere fastidiousness or impossible standards. She excused herself early, claiming fatigue though she felt anything but tired, her mind too active with questions that multiplied like shadows, and she sought refuge in the library where she had noticed earlier a collection that included several volumes she had long wished to read, thinking that losing herself in literature might quiet the confusion that had plagued her since arriving at Blackthorn Manor. The library occupied the west wing, a room of generous proportions lined floor to ceiling with books whose leather spines gleamed in lamplight, and she was examining a particularly fine edition of poetry when footsteps sounded behind her and Marcus's voice, quiet and somehow tentative in a way his public persona never allowed, said, "I hope I am not intruding. I often come here in the evenings, but I can leave if you prefer solitude." She turned to find him standing in the doorway with an uncertainty that seemed at odds with his usual assurance, and something in that vulnerability made her bold enough to say, "Please, stay, it is your library after all, and I confess I would welcome company that does not dissect one's character for entertainment." He stepped into the room fully then, and she saw relief cross his features like sunlight breaking through clouds, and he said, "They do not mean harm. Most of them, they simply cannot conceive that some choices arise from conviction rather than caprice," and there was in his voice such quiet weariness that she felt her heart contract with sympathy. "What conviction?" she asked, the question emerging before discretion could prevent it, and for a long moment he simply looked at her with those grey eyes that seemed to hold winter storms and summer skies in equal measure, and she thought he would retreat behind formality, and would deflect as he had deflected Lord Pemberton's intrusive humour, but instead he said, "The conviction that some things are worth waiting for, that constancy has value even when the world names it foolishness." And though his words remained oblique, Evelyn felt their weight settle around her like a cloak, both frightening and strangely comforting, as though she stood on the threshold of understanding something that might alter everything she had believed about her life and its limitations. The morning after the library encounter brought grey skies that pressed low over Blackthorn Manor, the kind of weather that seemed to mirror Evelyn's internal state of confusion and dawning awareness, and she found herself in the conservatory, examining orchids she barely saw, while her mind turned ceaselessly over Marcus's words about constancy and waiting, about things worth the patience of years. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she did not hear the Dowager Duchess approach until that formidable woman's voice, warm with affection and something that sounded like determination, said, "My dear Lady Evelyn, I wonder if you might spare me a moment. There is a matter I feel compelled to discuss, though my nephew would likely consider it interference of the most egregious sort." Evelyn turned to find the elderly Duchess regarding her with eyes remarkably similar to Marcus's, sharp with intelligence and kind with understanding, and something in that gaze suggested the conversation to come would be significant, beyond mere social pleasantries, and she felt her pulse quicken with apprehension and inexplicable hope. They settled on a bench positioned to overlook the gardens, where mist clung to the boxwood hedges like secrets reluctant to disperse, and the Dowager was silent for a long moment, as though gathering words, or perhaps courage, before she said, "I have watched you these past days, my dear, and I have watched my nephew, and I see things that perhaps you do not yet fully perceive, and I find I cannot in good conscience remain silent when a few words might illuminate what confusion obscures." Evelyn's hands tightened in her lap, her heart beating with sudden force against her ribs, and she managed to say, "Your Grace, I am not certain I understand." But the Dowager interrupted with gentle firmness, "You wonder at Marcus's attention to you, at the small kindnesses and the remembrance of details, at the way he watches you when he believes himself unobserved. I have seen your confusion, and I have seen also the beginning of hope you are afraid to acknowledge, and I think it is time you understood the truth that has shaped 15 years of my nephew's life." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread inexorably outward, and Evelyn felt something shift in her chest, some protective wall beginning to crack, and she whispered, "What truth?" The Dowager reached over to take her hand with surprising gentleness, and said, "That Marcus has refused every match proposed to him these 15 years, because his heart was given long ago to a woman he met one summer, a woman with whom he spent a single afternoon in conversation that somehow convinced him she was the only one he could ever love. And when he learned the next day that she was engaged to another, something in him simply stopped hoping for anyone else, stopped considering alternatives, and stopped living fully because the only life he wanted had been made impossible." Evelyn felt the words strike her with physical force, felt the world tilt and reform around this impossible revelation, and her mind raced backward through 15 years to that garden party, to a conversation with a young duke that had felt charged with possibility, and to the way her heart had responded to his attention before duty and family obligation had closed around her like a prison, and she heard herself say in a voice that seemed to come from very far away, "No, surely you do not mean he could not have," but even as she spoke denial, understanding was flooding through her with the inevitability of dawn, illuminating connections she had been too blind or too afraid to perceive. And the dowager said quietly, "He has loved you, my dear Evelyn, through all these years, loved you through your marriage to another, through your widowhood, through every season and every society event where he watched you from distance and never approached, because he believed you had made your choice and he would respect it. And he has refused every other woman because none of them were you, could never be you. And I tell you this not to burden you, but because I believe you deserve to know that the attention he shows you now is not sudden fancy, but the careful emergence of devotion that has waited patiently for any sign that it might be welcomed." The revelation crashed over Evelyn in waves, disbelief giving way to recognition to a grief so sharp it stole her breath as she thought of 15 years lost to misunderstanding and duty. And beneath the grief arose something more dangerous, more terrifying in its intensity, hope, fragile and insistent, whispering that perhaps it was not too late, that perhaps the autumn of her life might hold possibilities the spring had denied. And she wept, then, tears she could not contain, while the dowager held her hand and the mist slowly lifted from the gardens beyond. Weeks passed after Evelyn's departure from Blackthorn Manor, weeks that moved with the strange quality of time that seems both impossibly slow and frighteningly swift, and she found herself back in the familiar rhythms of her life, managing the estate and caring for Charlotte and young Thomas. Yet nothing felt quite as it had before, for the dowager's revelation had shattered some fundamental understanding she had held about her existence and its possibilities. She could not forget Marcus's face, as she had seen it that last morning when she made her farewells. The careful control he maintained, even as his eyes held questions he did not voice, nor the weight of knowing that 15 years of his life had been shaped by a single afternoon they had shared when she was 25, and foolish enough to believe duty mattered more than the sudden recognition of kindred spirits. She told herself it was impossible, that women of 40 did not suddenly find themselves the object of devoted constancy, that she had misunderstood, or that the dowager had exaggerated. Yet even as she constructed these rational defenses, her heart whispered different truths, and when the first letter arrived bearing the Blackthorn seal, her hands trembled as she broke the wax. The letter was formal in its opening, as propriety demanded. Marcus inquiring after her health and safe journey with the careful courtesy of a host, ensuring his guests' well-being. But there in the second paragraph emerged something more, a reference to their library conversation, a hope that she had found the volume of poetry she had been examining, a mention that he had been reading the same poet and found certain verses spoke to conditions of patience and constancy that he had long contemplated. She read the letter 3 times, searching for meanings beneath the surface of polite phrases, and when she finally penned her response, she found herself matching his care, in her words proper yet carrying their own subtle weights, and thus began a correspondence that would span the autumn weeks, like a bridge constructed with infinite patience across a chasm both vast and intimate. His letters came weekly, then twice weekly, and she found herself waiting for them with an anticipation that felt both wonderful and terrifying. For with each letter Marcus revealed himself more fully, his thoughts on literature and philosophy, his concerns for the tenants on his estates, his affection for his aunt despite her meddling nature, and gradually, carefully, like a man approaching something precious and easily frightened, references to the past and to waiting, and to the peculiar pain of loving from distance while respecting another's choices. She learned that he had attended her husband's funeral from the back of the church, unseen and offering no condolences because he had no right to comfort her, that he had watched her take on the care of her brother's children after the carriage accident, and had admired her courage from afar, that every refusal he had made to marriage proposals over 15 years had been measured against the memory of one perfect afternoon when conversation had flowed like water, finding its natural course, and he had known with absolute certainty that this was the woman with whom he wished to spend his life. Evelyn wept over that letter, wept for the young Duke who had loved silently while she had been trapped in a marriage made for duty that brought neither happiness nor fulfillment, wept for lost years and for the impossible miracle of discovering that she had been loved truly, constantly, patiently loved through all the seasons when she had believed herself merely tolerated by a world that pitied her unmarried state. Autumn arrived in earnest, painting the trees in golds and crimsons that reminded her she stood in the autumn of her own life. And yet the season brought not the chill of endings, but an unexpected warmth, for Marcus's letters continued, and her responses grew less guarded, and she began to allow herself the dangerous luxury of hope, began to wonder whether it might not be too late after all, whether life might yet hold chapters she had believed forever closed, whether a woman of 40 might dare to reach for happiness she had thought belonged only to the young and fortunate. Marcus's letter requesting permission to visit came in late October, when the estate gardens had turned to bronze and gold, and though the formal language spoke of wishing to pay his respects and see how she fared after their correspondence, Evelyn understood the true question beneath the words. Might he come to know the life she had built, the children who had become her purpose, the woman she had become through years of quiet duty and private sorrow? She granted permission with hands that trembled slightly as she penned the acceptance, and when his carriage arrived 3 days later, she watched from an upper window as he emerged, tall and composed in his dark travelling coat, and felt her heart perform that same peculiar leap it had managed 15 years ago in a garden that now seemed to belong to a different lifetime entirely. Charlotte and Thomas had been told that the Duke of Blackthorn would be visiting, and while Charlotte at 15 understood something of the significance and watched her aunt with knowing eyes that held barely suppressed delight, Thomas at 12 cared only that a duke was impressive and might have stories of London, and perhaps know something of horses, and Evelyn loved them both fiercely in that moment for being exactly themselves without artifice or calculation. Marcus's meeting with the children revealed dimensions of his character that letters, however intimate their revelations, could not fully capture. He listened to Thomas's enthusiastic discourse on the new colt in the stables with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance, asked questions that demonstrated actual knowledge and curiosity, and when Charlotte shyly presented a watercolor she had painted of the estate gardens, he examined it with a care that brought color to the girl's cheeks and made Evelyn's throat tight with emotion, for here was a man who understood that kindness to those she loved was the surest path to her own heart. The first 2 days of his visit passed in a gentle rhythm of country life, walks through the estate, where Marcus observed her management with clear respect, meals where conversation flowed easily between the 4 of them, evenings in the drawing room where Thomas read aloud from adventure novels while Charlotte worked on her embroidery, and the adults sat in companionable silence that felt more intimate than any declaration. Then on the 3rd night Thomas woke with fever, the sudden violent fever that strikes terror into any guardian's heart, and Evelyn spent the dark hours sponging his burning forehead and whispering prayers, while the household physician was summoned and pronounced it, likely an ague that must run its course, and when she emerged grey-faced from the sick room at dawn, she found Marcus waiting in the corridor still fully dressed, and he said simply, "Tell me what you need," and something in her chest that had been holding itself rigid for 15 years quietly broke open. He stayed, not retreating to London as propriety might have suggested, not maintaining polite distance as a formal suitor might, but staying through the crisis with a steadiness that proved devotion more eloquently than any poetry, and in the quiet hours of the sick room where they took turns sitting with Thomas while the boy's fever raged and broke and raged again, Evelyn discovered the deepest truth of Marcus's character in small gestures, the gentleness with which he helped lift Thomas to take water, the way he read to the boy in his careful deep voice when delirium made Thomas fearful, the fact that he never once suggested his presence was extraordinary or required gratitude, simply existed as a steady presence in the crisis, as though there were nowhere else he would rather be. And Evelyn understood then that constancy was not merely waiting, but this, the choice to remain present in difficulty, to offer strength without expectation of return, and to love, not just in imagined futures, but in the mundane and frightening present where real life was actually lived. Thomas's fever broke on the 4th morning, with the gentleness of dawn light spreading across a landscape, and when the physician pronounced him past the crisis and needing only rest and nourishment to recover fully, Evelyn felt something release in her chest that had been wound tight with fear, and she stood at the sick-room window watching the pale November sun touch the frost-covered garden, while behind her Marcus spoke quietly to the boy about how brave he had been and promised to show him a particular trick with the new colt once he was strong enough to walk to the stables. Charlotte had fallen asleep in the chair beside her brother's bed, exhausted from her own vigil, and Marcus lifted the girl with surprising tenderness and carried her to her own chamber, and when he returned, he found Evelyn still at the window, with tears sliding silently down her face. Not tears of grief now, but of overwhelming emotion that had nowhere else to go. The accumulation of fear and relief and gratitude, and something far more dangerous that she had been holding back through all the crisis hours. He came to stand beside her without touching, his presence solid and warm, and after a long moment of silence he said quietly, "I have spent 15 years waiting, Evelyn. 15 years in which I might have married another and built a different life. And there were times when I questioned whether I was being foolish, whether devotion to a memory was simply another form of cowardice, whether I was using that single afternoon as an excuse to avoid the risks of real connection." And she turned to look at him then, seeing the lines that time had etched around his eyes, the silver threading his dark hair, the face that had become distinguished rather than merely handsome, and he continued, "But these past days, watching you with Thomas and Charlotte, seeing the life you have built from duty and love, understanding the woman you have become through years, I did not share. I know now that waiting was not foolishness but the only honest choice I could have made, because love is not merely feeling but recognition, and I recognized you 15 years ago as surely as I recognize the sun that rises each morning, and that recognition has never faltered, never dimmed, and never been surpassed by any other woman I have met in all the years between then and now." His words broke something open in her that had been sealed since the morning 15 years ago when she had accepted another man's proposal because her father had said it was a good match and her duty was clear, and she wept. Then not quietly but with the full force of grief for time lost and for the young woman who had made a choice she thought was right and had paid for it with years of quiet unhappiness, wept for the constancy she had not known existed until it was revealed to her, wept because at 40 she had believed all chances for genuine love had passed her by, and yet here stood a man who had waited through 15 years of refusals and loneliness because he had recognized in her something worth waiting for. And when Marcus finally touched her, his hand gentle on her shoulder, she turned into his embrace and let herself be held while the November sun climbed higher. And somewhere in the house, the sounds of morning routine continued, and Thomas slept peacefully in his bed, and the world went on turning. But here in this quiet room, two people who had been waiting for 15 years finally allowed themselves to acknowledge that the waiting might be reaching its end. When she could finally speak through the subsiding tears, Evelyn pulled back slightly from Marcus's embrace, her hands trembling as she wiped at her wet cheeks with a gesture that held something almost apologetic, as though she had committed some breach of propriety by allowing him to witness the fullness of her grief and confusion, and she said in a voice still thick with emotion, "You must understand 15 years ago, when my father told me that Lord Ashworth had made an offer, I was 25 and already considered nearly on the shelf, and my father's investments had failed, and my younger sisters needed dowries, and Lord Ashworth was wealthy and respectable and willing to overlook my advanced age." And Marcus remained very still, listening with an intensity that made her feel truly heard, perhaps for the first time in her life, and she continued, "I thought of you of that afternoon in the garden, and of the conversation we had shared about poetry and philosophy, and all the things that mattered to me that no one else seemed to care about. And I told myself I was being foolish, that a single conversation with a gentleman I barely knew could not be grounds for refusing a practical match, that duty and family obligation mattered more than the peculiar recognition I had felt when you looked at me as though you truly saw beneath the surface to something worth knowing." Her voice cracked on the final words, and she pressed her fingers to her lips for a moment before forcing herself to continue. "The marriage was not cruel, Lord Ashworth was not unkind, merely indifferent, and I learned quickly that the life of a wife whose purpose was to manage households and appear appropriately ornamental at social functions was a small life, a life of surfaces without depth, and I performed my duties adequately and tried not to think of that garden conversation too often because it hurt too much to remember that someone had once spoken to me as though my thoughts mattered, as though I was more than merely adequate." And she saw something tighten in Marcus's jaw, a flash of anger not at her but at the waste and sorrow of it all, and she pressed on, because now that she had begun this confession, she needed to finish it, needed him to understand why she had believed herself unworthy of the devotion he had revealed. "When Lord Ashworth died after 5 years of marriage, I felt guilty that my primary emotion was relief rather than grief, and when I came to manage my brother's estate after his death and care for Charlotte and Thomas, I found purpose finally in being needed rather than merely ornamental. But I truly believed, Marcus, that whatever capacity I might have had for the kind of love that poetry speaks of had been worn away by years of performing duty without joy, that I was too old and too tired and too damaged by compromise to deserve the kind of constancy you have shown, that if you knew the truth of my first marriage and my relief at its ending, you would understand that I am not the woman you remembered from that garden, not worthy of 15 years of waiting and devotion. She looked up at him then, with eyes still swimming with tears, searching his face for the disappointment or disillusionment she feared she would find, and instead saw only a tenderness so profound it made her breath catch, and he raised his hand to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness, and said in a voice rough with emotion, "You have always been worthy, Evelyn, not because of what you have endured or despite it, but simply because you are yourself, and that self is what I recognized 15 years ago, and what I recognize now, and nothing you have told me diminishes that recognition or my certainty that waiting for you was the only choice I could have made." Tay. The news of the Duke of Blackthorn's marked attentions toward Lady Evelyn Ashworth spread through London society with the speed and venom of poison seeping through clear water, and within a fortnight of Marcus's return to town, for he had stayed at her estate for 3 weeks, following Thomas's recovery, before duty demanded his presence at Parliament, the drawing-rooms and ballrooms hummed with speculation that ranged from the merely curious to the deliberately cruel. Evelyn heard the whispers, even when they were not intended for her ears, caught the phrases "past her prime" and "desperate maneuver," and whatever could his grace be thinking, delivered with the sort of false sympathy that masked genuine malice, and though she had endured years of being society's object of pity as the fading spinster who managed her brother's estate, there was something far more cutting about being discussed as a schemer who had somehow trapped the most eligible bachelor in England through means that must certainly be calculated, since they could not possibly be based on genuine regard. Lady Pemberton, who had thrown 3 daughters at Marcus over the years with increasing desperation, remarked loudly at a musicale that it was extraordinary what some women would do to secure a title, and though she did not name Evelyn directly, the pointed glances in her direction left no doubt as to her target, and Mrs. Hartwick, whose own marriage to a wealthy merchant had never quite erased the taint of her family's financial difficulties, opined with false concern that perhaps the Duke was simply being kind to a woman of unfortunate circumstances, and surely everyone knew that kindness should not be mistaken for romantic interest. The words accumulated like small cuts, each one individually bearable, but collectively bleeding her confidence away, and Evelyn found herself lying awake in the deep hours of night, wondering whether Marcus truly understood what associating with her would cost him socially, whether his constancy was based on a memory that did not account for the reality of what she had become, a woman of 40, with no fortune, no exceptional beauty, no connections that would enhance his standing, nothing to offer except a heart that had been battered by duty and loss, and was only now tentatively opening to the possibility of genuine love. She thought of his position, of the duties and expectations that came with his title, of the young and beautiful women who would be far more suitable matches, and the old familiar voice of unworthiness that had been her companion through years of performing duty without joy, whispered that perhaps society was right. Perhaps she should withdraw gracefully before she caused him embarrassment. Perhaps true love meant protecting him from the consequences of a devotion that she still could not quite believe she deserved. The internal crisis reached its peak one grey December afternoon, when she sat in her small parlour with rain drumming against the windows and a letter from Marcus unopened on her lap, and she found herself genuinely contemplating whether the kindest action would be to write to him and release him from whatever obligation he felt, to tell him that she understood his compassion, but could not in good conscience allow him to sacrifice his reputation and social standing for a woman whom society had already judged and found wanting, and the fact that this thought brought not relief but a grief so profound it felt like drowning, told her that her heart had already made a choice that her mind was still questioning. But fear of being the source of his diminishment, fear of proving society right about her unsuitability, fear of not being enough, kept her frozen in that parlour chair while the rain continued its relentless rhythm and the unopened letter seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Marcus learned of the vicious gossip circulating about Evelyn through his aunt, the Dowager Duchess, who appeared at his London residence on a cold December morning with an expression of such righteous fury that he knew immediately something had transpired that demanded his attention, and when she recounted the commentary she had overheard at Lady Pemberton's card party the previous evening, the speculation about Evelyn's calculated pursuit, the sneering remarks about her age and lack of fortune, the cruel implication that she must have employed some desperate feminine artifice to capture his interest, Marcus felt a cold rage settle over him that was all the more potent for being entirely controlled, a fury not loud but absolute, and he realized with sudden clarity that his careful courtship, his attempts to proceed with propriety and discretion to protect Evelyn's reputation, had instead left her vulnerable to the very cruelty he had hoped to spare her, that his silence about his intentions had created a vacuum that society's worst impulses had rushed to fill with poison. He made his decision in that moment, and within 2 hours he had sent word to every family of consequence in London that the Duke of Blackthorn would be attending the Haverford ball that evening, and that he wished Lady Evelyn Ashworth to be informed of his particular desire for her presence, a message so deliberate and formal that it could not be misinterpreted. And when evening arrived, he dressed with unusual care and arrived at the Haverford residence early, positioning himself near the entrance with a visibility that was entirely intentional for a man who typically preferred the shadows of social gatherings. Evelyn arrived with Charlotte as her companion, and he saw the moment she noticed him, saw the flash of uncertainty and something like fear cross her face, and he moved toward her immediately, with a purposefulness that drew every eye in the crowded ballroom, and he bowed over her hand with a formality that would have been appropriate for royalty, and said clearly enough for those nearby to hear, "Lady Evelyn, you honor me with your presence. I have been anticipating this evening with particular eagerness, as there is a matter of some importance I wish to make known," and he offered his arm and led her to the center of the room, where the crowd parted instinctively before them. And in that moment, when the music had ended and conversation had dimmed, and all of London society seemed to hold its breath, Marcus turned to face the assembly with Evelyn's hand still resting on his arm, and spoke with the clear authority of a man who had commanded attention in Parliament and would brook no contradiction. "I believe it is time to address certain speculations that have been circulating regarding my attentions to Lady Evelyn Ashworth," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, "and to correct the misapprehensions that seem to have taken root in minds that prefer malicious fantasy to simple truth," and he felt Evelyn stiffen beside him, but he pressed gently on her hand in reassurance, and continued, "For 15 years I have refused every match proposed to me, and society in its wisdom has attributed this to pride, to impossible standards, to eccentricity or coldness of temperament, and I have allowed these speculations to stand uncorrected, because the truth was a private matter that concerned only myself. But I find I can no longer remain silent when that silence permits cruelty toward a woman whose worth exceeds that of everyone in this room, including myself." And there was steel in his voice now, a controlled fury that made several of the assembled ladies pale and gentlemen shift uncomfortably, and he turned slightly to look at Evelyn, whose eyes were wide with shock and beginning to shimmer with tears, and he said more gently, but still clearly enough for all to hear, "15 years ago I met Lady Evelyn at a summer garden party, and in the course of a single afternoon's conversation I recognized in her a depth of character, an intelligence of mind, and a genuine beauty of spirit that I knew I would never find replicated in any other woman. And though circumstances prevented any understanding between us at that time, I have measured every woman I have met since against that recognition and found them all wanting not because of any fault in them, but because my heart had already made its choice." And he heard the collective intake of breath from the assembled crowd, saw Lady Pemberton's face flush with mortification, and he concluded with quiet finality, "I have waited 15 years not out of obstinacy but out of love, and I would gladly wait 15 more if necessary, though I hope most fervently that Lady Evelyn will not require such patience from me and anyone who questions her worthiness or suggests that she has employed any artifice beyond being herself, questions my judgment and insults a woman whose integrity and character surpass those of her critics as the sun surpasses a candle's flame." The silence that followed Marcus's declaration in the Haverford ballroom was absolute, and Evelyn found herself unable to speak or move as tears spilled down her cheeks, while the assembled company remained frozen in shock. And it was only when the Dowager Duchess began to applaud with deliberate approval that the spell broke, and others joined in uncertain acknowledgement of what they had witnessed. But Marcus paid no attention to any of them, his focus entirely on Evelyn as he gently guided her toward the terrace doors and out into the December night, where the cold air felt blessedly cleansing after the suffocating atmosphere of judgment and speculation. They stood in silence for a long moment while Evelyn struggled to compose herself, her gloved hands trembling as she pressed them against her face, and Marcus waited with the patience that had characterized 15 years of his life, until finally she lowered her hands and looked at him with eyes that held wonder and disbelief, and a fragile hope that seemed almost painful in its tentative emergence, and she whispered, "You should not have spoken, so you have made yourself vulnerable to society's censure on my behalf." But he smiled slightly and replied, "I have never cared for society's censure, only for its cruelty toward you, and that I will not tolerate." And then his expression grew serious, and he said quietly, "Evelyn, I realize that this is neither the time nor the place I would have chosen, but I find I cannot wait any longer to ask you a question that has lived in my heart for 15 years. And before she could respond, he continued, "Will you come with me, not now, not tonight, but tomorrow? There is a place I wish to take you, where we can speak without an audience, where I can ask you properly what I should have asked 15 years ago had circumstances permitted." The following afternoon found them traveling in Marcus's carriage through countryside that had grown familiar to Evelyn. Over the past months, and when they turned onto the drive leading to Havenbrook House, the estate where that fateful summer garden party had taken place 15 years prior, she understood with a clarity that stole her breath what he intended, and her heart began to race with an anticipation that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The house itself was closed for winter, its owners in London for the season, but Marcus had obtained permission to visit the grounds, and he helped her down from the carriage and offered his arm as they walked through gates that opened onto gardens, now touched by winter's hand, the flower beds dormant and the trees stripped of leaves except for the stubborn brown foliage that clung to the oaks, and autumn leaves for some had fallen only recently in December's mild spells, skittered across the path before them as they walked in silence toward the rose arbor, where they had first spoken all those years ago. The arbor itself was bare now, the roses cut back to sleeping stumps, but the bench remained where it had been, weathered by 15 winters but still solid, and Marcus guided her to sit and then joined her, and their bodies close in the cold air, and for a moment he simply looked at her with an expression of such profound tenderness that she felt tears threatening again, and then he reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box that showed signs of age and much handling, and he opened it to reveal a ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, elegant and understated and clearly chosen with care long ago, and he said quietly, "I purchased this 16 years ago, before I ever met you, thinking someday I would find the woman I wished to marry, and then I met you, and knew I had bought it for you, though I did not know it at the time, and I have carried it with me ever since that day, through 15 years of waiting, through every refused proposal and every speculation about my intentions, because I knew that if I ever had the chance to offer it to you, I wanted to be ready. I wanted to be able to say that I had held on to this symbol of my commitment through all the years that separated us." He took her left hand in his, and she felt the trembling in his fingers that matched her own, and he said with simple directness that held more weight than any flowery speech, "Evelyn Ashworth, you are the only woman I have ever loved, the only woman I will ever love, and I am asking you not out of obligation or pity or any sentiment other than the absolute certainty that my life is only complete when you are in it. Will you marry me? Will you allow me the honor and joy of spending whatever years remain to us, proving every day that you are cherished and valued and loved beyond measure?" And Evelyn, who had spent so many years believing she was unworthy of such devotion, found that the answer rose from somewhere deep within her that had never stopped hoping despite all evidence to the contrary, and she said through tears that were now tears of joy rather than sorrow, "Yes, yes, Marcus, I will marry you." And as he slipped the ring onto her finger where it fit, as though it had been made for her alone, the winter sun broke through the clouds overhead, and illuminated the dormant garden with unexpected warmth, and she thought that perhaps life was like these gardens, seeming dead in winter, but holding beneath the surface all the promise of spring's eventual return. Months passed, and the winter that had witnessed their engagement softened into early spring, and with the changing season came the gradual transformation of their private understanding into public reality through the countless details that comprised wedding preparations, though Evelyn found herself perpetually startled by how different this process felt from her first engagement 15 years prior. Then she had been swept along by her family's ambitions and societal expectations, her own desires secondary to duty, but now every decision was made together with Marcus, every choice reflecting their shared vision of a life built on genuine partnership rather than social performance. The guest list became an exercise in distinguishing between those who had remained kind during the difficult months of gossip and those who had contributed to the cruelty, and Marcus demonstrated a ruthless clarity in his determinations that made Evelyn laugh despite herself when he crossed out name after name with decisive strokes of his pen, saying with dry humor, "Lady Pemberton need not trouble herself to witness our happiness after she took such pleasure in questioning your worthiness." And she marveled at how protected she felt, how cherished. This man who had waited 15 years now dedicating himself to ensuring that every aspect of their wedding reflected the honor he believed she deserved. They spent hours together in the planning, small domestic moments that revealed their compatibility in ways grand gestures. Never could Marcus, discovering that Evelyn preferred simple wildflowers to elaborate hothouse arrangements, and immediately instructing the gardeners at Blackthorn Manor to cultivate meadow gardens for the ceremony, Evelyn learning that Marcus had a quiet passion for poetry and selecting readings for the service that spoke to themes of patience and enduring devotion, both of them finding joy in these small revelations and in the gradual weaving together of their separate lives into a shared tapestry. Charlotte and young Thomas, Evelyn's niece and nephew, were delighted by the developments and threw themselves into preparations with enthusiasm that warmed her heart, Charlotte insisting on helping select Evelyn's wedding gown and declaring with the fierce loyalty of youth that her aunt would be the most beautiful bride London had ever seen, regardless of what the spiteful gossips claimed, and Thomas, forming an immediate attachment to Marcus that manifested in constant questions about horses and estate management and the Duke's experiences in Parliament, and Marcus responded to the boy's attention with a patience and genuine interest that showed Evelyn yet another dimension of the man she was to marry. There were moments when the wonder of it all overwhelmed her. She would be examining fabric samples or reviewing menus, and would suddenly have to pause, struck by the realization that this was truly happening, that she was not dreaming, that Marcus Rothwell genuinely wished to marry her and counted himself fortunate in the prospect. And during one such moment Marcus found her standing motionless in the morning room of her estate, with tears streaming down her face, and he immediately came to her with concern until she explained through her tears that these were tears of happiness, that she simply could not quite believe that she was allowed this much joy after so many years of resignation, and he had held her and said quietly, "You are allowed every happiness, Evelyn. You have always deserved far more than life has given you, and I intend to spend the rest of my days attempting to remedy that injustice." The wedding itself was planned for late April, when the Blackthorn Gardens would be at their most beautiful, and as the date approached, Evelyn found herself moving through her days in a state of quiet contentment that felt almost unfamiliar after decades of mere acceptance. And when the morning of her wedding arrived with clear skies and gentle sunshine, she dressed in a gown of ivory silk that Charlotte pronounced perfect, while the girl fussed over the arrangement of wildflowers in Evelyn's hair, and as she prepared to leave for Blackthorn Manor, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and saw not an aging spinster grateful for unexpected rescue, but a woman genuinely loved and choosing love in return, and the distinction made all the difference. The ceremony took place in the chapel at Blackthorn Manor, with only those closest to them in attendance, the Dowager Duchess beaming with satisfaction at having engineered their reunion, Charlotte and Thomas standing as witnesses, a handful of true friends who had remained steadfast during the gossip, and the household staff who had served Marcus faithfully through 15 years of waiting, and who now watched with undisguised emotion as their master finally claimed his happiness. And when Marcus took Evelyn's hand and spoke his vows, with a steady voice that carried absolute conviction, promising to honor and cherish her for all the days of his life. She felt 15 years of sorrow and resignation fall away like a discarded cloak, and when she made her own vows in return, promising to love him with the fullness of a heart that had always been his, though circumstances had kept them apart, she knew she was speaking a truth that transcended the merely ceremonial and touched something eternal. And as they were pronounced husband and wife, and Marcus kissed her with a tenderness that held both reverence and joy, she thought that perhaps some stories required long chapters of separation to make the eventual union all the more precious, all the more deeply appreciated for having been so long deferred. 5 years passed, and spring returned to Blackthorn Manor, as it did every April. But the estate that had once been known for its imposing coldness and austere formality had been transformed into something altogether different. Warmth emanated from every window, where curtains now hung in cheerful colors rather than heavy burgundy. Laughter echoed through corridors that had known decades of silence, and the gardens that Marcus had once walked alone now teemed with life, as children raced along the paths and played among the flower beds that Evelyn had redesigned, to include not only formal plantings but wild corners where imagination could flourish unrestrained. Evelyn herself, now 45 and the Duchess of Blackthorn for 5 years, stood at the window of the morning room watching, as her daughter, 4-year-old Catherine, with Marcus's dark hair and her own grey eyes, attempted to teach her younger brother James the proper way to feed the ducks at the ornamental pond, while Charlotte, now 20, and visiting from London, where she had recently become engaged to a respectable young solicitor, supervised with the patient affection of an older sister, and Thomas, 18, and preparing to enter Oxford in the autumn, carried James on his shoulders when the 2-year-old grew tired of walking, and the scene filled Evelyn with a contentment so profound that she sometimes had to pause and simply breathe through the magnitude of it, this life she had been given after so many years of believing herself consigned to loneliness. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks prior, a ball at Haverford House, the same venue where Marcus had made his public declaration 5 years ago, where society had witnessed his devotion and been forced to acknowledge what their gossip could not diminish, and Evelyn had felt a moment of hesitation upon seeing the gilt-edged card, memories of older balls, where she had endured pitying glances and whispered commentary rising unbidden. But Marcus had simply taken her hand and said, "We need not attend if it causes you discomfort," and she had realized with sudden clarity that she wanted to go, wanted to walk into that ballroom not as the pitiable spinster she had once been, but as the woman she had become through love and partnership and the gradual healing of old wounds. And so on the appointed evening she dressed in a gown of deep sapphire silk that Marcus had commissioned from London's finest modiste, the color chosen to match the ring she still wore and never removed, and when she descended the stairs to find him waiting in the entrance hall, dressed in formal black that emphasized the silver now threading through his dark hair, he looked at her with an expression of such open admiration that she felt beautiful, not because society might deem her so, but because he saw her thus, and his opinion was the only one that had ever truly mattered. They arrived at Haverford House as the ball was well underway, and when they were announced His Grace the Duke of Blackthorn and Her Grace the Duchess, Evelyn felt the familiar hush fall over the nearest guests, but this time the silence held no malice, only curiosity and a certain respect, for the story of the Duke who had waited 15 years had become legend in the 5 years since their marriage, and society had been forced to acknowledge that what they had dismissed as impossible had proven to be simply inevitable, requiring only patience and the courage to claim it when the moment arrived. As they moved through the ballroom, Evelyn found herself comparing this entrance to that ball 5 years ago, when she had walked alone, enduring scrutiny and pity, and the contrast was so stark that she had to press Marcus's arm for reassurance, and he understood immediately, drawing her closer and murmuring, "You are the most remarkable woman in this room, and I am the most fortunate man in it." And she believed him because 5 years of marriage had taught her that Marcus never spoke anything but truth, especially in matters of the heart. The ball concluded near midnight, and they returned to Blackthorn Manor through roads silvered by moonlight, both pleasantly tired from dancing and conversation, and as their carriage rolled up the familiar drive, Evelyn felt Marcus's hand tighten around hers in a gesture that had become their private language for contentment, for coming home not just to a place but to each other, And when they entered the house, they found the Dowager Duchess still awake in the drawing room despite the late hour, reading by the fire and waiting to hear Catherine recite a poem she had memorized that day. And this simple domestic scene, the grandmother's patience, the child's earnest performance, Marcus's quiet pride as he lifted his daughter onto his knee to listen, struck Evelyn as the truest measure of their transformation. How the man society had called ice-cold now moved through his days with a warmth that radiated from genuine happiness rather than social performance. The daily rhythms they had established over 5 years of marriage revealed a partnership built on mutual respect and deepening affection. Mornings often found them in Marcus's study working together on estate correspondence, Evelyn having proven herself remarkably skilled at managing the various properties and investments that comprised the Blackthorn holdings, her years of running her brother's estate translating seamlessly into Duchess's responsibilities, and Marcus freely acknowledged that the improvements in tenant relations and agricultural yields since their marriage owed everything to her insights and nothing to his previous methods. Afternoons were reserved for the children, both of them believing that parenthood required presence rather than delegation to nurses and governesses. And so they walked the gardens with Catherine and James, read stories, answered endless questions, provided the attentive love that shaped young souls far more effectively than formal instruction ever could. Evenings brought the quiet companionship Evelyn had never experienced in her first marriage. She and Marcus often sitting together in the library reading or discussing the day's events, or simply existing in comfortable silence that required no performance. And it was during these evening hours that she most acutely felt how profoundly blessed she was. How different this life was from what she had resigned herself to expecting. Marcus himself had been transformed by their union in ways that went beyond the obvious addition of family and domestic warmth. The rigid control that had characterized his bearing during those 15 years of waiting had softened into something more flexible and human. He laughed more readily now, expressed affection without the guardedness that had once made him seem cold to those who did not know him. And while he still maintained the dignity appropriate to his position, he no longer wielded formality as armor against potential hurt, and Evelyn understood that this transformation had occurred because he no longer had to protect himself, no longer had to maintain defenses against hope deferred, for hope had been fulfilled, and the waiting had ended in exactly the reunion he had believed possible, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. She herself had blossomed in ways she could never have anticipated. The resignation and quiet sorrow that had shadowed her during those years as a pitied spinster had lifted completely, replaced by a confidence that came not from social position, but from being genuinely known and genuinely loved. And she moved through her days now with a lightness that sometimes startled her when she caught sight of herself in mirrors and saw not weariness, but vitality, not mere dignity, but actual joy. One evening in late spring, after the children had been settled for the night and the house had grown quiet around them, Evelyn and Marcus sat together in the small parlor that had become their private retreat, she with her needlework and he with correspondence that required his attention. And the fire burning low in the grate cast gentle shadows across the room, and after a time Marcus set aside his letters and simply watched her with an expression of such profound contentment that she looked up and asked what he was thinking. And he replied quietly, "I was thinking that I would wait another 15 years if necessary to arrive at this moment, this life, this profound peace of having you here beside me." And she set down her needlework and went to him, settling into his embrace with the ease of long practice, and said against his shoulder, "Then it is fortunate that neither of us must wait any longer, for we have already arrived at where we were always meant to be." And they sat thus for a long while as the fire died to embers and the spring night deepened around the house, two people who had taken the long path to happiness and who treasured it all the more for having understood what it meant to live without it, their patience and constancy finally rewarded with the simple, extraordinary gift of being together, of being home. Dear listener, as we close the pages of this story and let its final echoes settle into silence, I would ask you to consider what we have witnessed together in the lives of Evelyn and Marcus, for theirs is not simply a tale of romance recovered or patience rewarded, but rather a profound meditation on the truth that love recognizes no timeline imposed by society, no expiration date stamped upon the human heart by those who measure worth in youth and novelty rather than depth and constancy. How often we are told, are we not, that certain seasons of life must contain certain experiences, that if love has not arrived by a particular year, then it never shall, that those who reach 40 or beyond without having secured affection are somehow finished with that chapter, relegated to watching from the margins, while others live the stories they themselves have been denied. And yet, Evelyn's life demonstrates the falseness of such cruel arithmetic, for at 40 she stood at what she believed was the end of possibility, and society agreed with her assessment, pitied her for it, whispered about her at balls, and gathered her into that category of women deemed surplus to the marriage market. And she had accepted this judgment as she accepted autumn's chill, with resignation born of exhaustion rather than genuine conviction. But Marcus teaches us something even more radical, does he not? For his waiting was not passive resignation but active faith, 15 years of refusals that society interpreted as pride or peculiarity, when in truth they represented the most profound form of devotion. The willingness to remain alone rather than settle for companionship that was not communion, to endure speculation and criticism rather than betray the truth of his heart. And in this he shows us that real love does not fade with time but rather deepens, becomes more certain, more willing to wait, because it recognizes something worth waiting for. Consider how their story contradicts everything we are taught about timing and readiness, how Evelyn at 40 possessed depths of character that her 25-year-old self could not have offered, how the sorrows she had endured and the responsibilities she had shouldered had refined her into someone capable of true partnership rather than merely decorative companionship, how Marcus's 15 years of waiting had not been wasted, but rather had been the necessary preparation for recognizing and cherishing what he was finally given. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson we might carry away from their experience, that our timelines are not society's timelines, that the chapters we believe finished may only be pausing before continuation, that the story we think we know may yet have acts unwritten and transformations we cannot currently imagine. If you are listening to this in a season of your own waiting, whether you are 25 or 40 or 60, whether you have loved and lost or never yet loved at all, whether society has placed you in categories that feel like prisons, or whether you have placed yourself there through resignation to judgments that were never yours to accept, I would offer you Evelyn and Marcus as testimony that it is never too late, that genuine love waits and transforms and arrives precisely when it is meant to, that patience is not weakness, but rather the quiet strength of those who understand that some things cannot be rushed and should not be compromised, and that the waiting itself, though painful, it is not wasted if it prepares us to recognize and receive the gift when it finally arrives. May you find peace in your own timing, whatever season you inhabit, and may you hold space for possibilities you have not yet imagined, and may you rest tonight knowing that your story, like Evelyn's, may yet contain chapters that will transform everything you thought you knew about what your life could hold. This has been a Romantic Tales production, and if this story has touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe to our channel, to share it with someone who might need its message, and to return next time for another journey into the landscapes where patience meets destiny and love finds its way home.